and bear with us. We will be beginning in 4 minutes. Good morning again, everyone. We're at 10:05, so we will begin. People can continue to join. We welcome the audience that is with us on Zoom as well as on streaming platforms, YouTube and Facebook. My name is Rianne Rollock, Senior Specialist at Niehurst, and I will be your moderator for this morning's event. Welcome to part 3 of Niehurst Innovation and Entrepreneurship Ecosystem webinar series. The goal of this series, and in particular this morning's topic, is to increase awareness and develop an understanding of the various international best practices within this ecosystem, with a view of also promoting a collaborative framework. This aligns to our mandate at Niehurst to promote science, technology, and innovation in Trinidad and Tobago, and enhance the innovative, creative, and entrepreneurial capabilities of the general population. Please be advised that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but feel free to place your questions in the chat and they will be addressed at the end. So continue to engage in the chat. We welcome it. Today's topic is global trends and prospects for scaling up innovation and entrepreneurship, which will be presented by Dr. Keith Nurse. Brief disclaimer, the views of the presenter are not necessarily shared by Niehurst, but we welcome Dr. Nurse's opinion on this topic as a respected subject matter expert. Dr. Nurse is the president of the College of Science, Technology, and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, or COSTAATT. He is currently serving his third term as an expert member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. Dr. Nurse is also the chair of Caribbean Tales Worldwide Distribution Incorporated Incubator and the executive producer of the docudrama Forward Home, The Power of the Caribbean Diaspora. He is the former principal CEO of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, St. Lucia, and has worked as a senior economist and advisor on structural policies and innovation at the OECD Development in Paris. He also previously served as the World Trade Organization chair at the University of the West Indies, where he served in multiple capacities on each of the 3 land-based campuses. He has worked as a researcher, advisor, and consultant to governments and international and regional organizations around the world, and has published over 100 scholarly papers and articles on a wide array of topics such as creative industries and digital economy, gender and economic restructuring, and industrial policy and innovation governance, just to name a few. I now welcome Dr. Nurse.
Hello, good morning. Hi, Rianne. Thank you
very
much.
Hi, Dr. Nurse.
You can hear me well?
Yes, I can. I hope everybody heard me well.
No, thanks very much.
I'll hand over to you now, Dr. Nurse, to take us through your presentation.
Okay, great. It's a real pleasure and honor to be participating in this webinar series. NEHUS is one of my favorite institutions here in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, when I first started doing research on this area of innovation and so on, close to 20 years ago, I had to turn to NEHUS because really, in effect, NEHUS was the key and the only institution that was collecting data on this area of research and development, science and technology, and so on. And so I'm eternally grateful for NEHUS.
Oh, thank you for that acknowledgement, Dr. Nurse. We appreciate it.
No. It's very much. And I would say that NEHUS is the institution in the English-speaking Caribbean and collects the best data in this arena. And I always use the adage that if you're not measuring it, it means you're not managing it. And so it's really important that, that we have institutions that are mapping and documenting this critical element of our economy and society. And I would say that throughout the rest of the Caribbean, we are not doing this well enough. We need to bump up what we're doing in Trinidad, but at least we have an NEHUS. So let me put it that way. I've been asked to talk about global trends and opportunities for upskilling or upscaling innovation and entrepreneurship in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm actually not just talking about Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, I'll be talking about the wider Caribbean because we are indeed part of a region that I think is underinvesting in innovation, and consequently, we have a weak entrepreneurship culture. And this is ultimately reflected in the fact that the Caribbean is one of the slowest growth regions in the world. We have high debt, low growth, and with a whole range of cascading challenges, from climate change to having some of the highest rates of chronic non-communicable diseases, a huge food import bill that keeps rising. We're in the top 10 or top 20 in the world in terms of food imports per capita. And, just yesterday I went to the Association of Police Commissioners Conference meeting at the Hyatt, and the Caribbean is in the top 20, several Caribbean countries are in the top 20 for homicide rates. So all across the board, there is a huge demand and need for us to facilitate innovation and transformation in Caribbean society. So I'm just saying that as the overarching framework or rationale for discussing this topic. It's not just about the economy, it's not just about business, it's not just about jobs, it's about how we restructure our society to serve the needs of the nation and the region and the people that live in it, as well as the the environmental systems that we inhabit. So that being said, I'm going to try and make this as quickly as possible so we have enough time for discussion. I think that's where the action is going to really happen. So let me see if I can go to the next slide. Just bear with me. Start not moving. All right. What am I attempting to do? 4 quick things. Talk about the rationale for innovation and entrepreneurship as an area of focus. Review the trade performance. And why do I talk about trade? Well, in small economies, trade is a really critical element of our society and economy. We tend to have very high trade to GDP ratios. And because we have small economies, any innovation actually either has to compete with global enterprises and global products and services, or we have to have a capacity to export them. So the tradability of our innovations is a critical dimension of the issue. And then I'll talk about innovation performance and review some of the data that we have. And then lastly, talk about the trade innovation, a governance framework that we need to be grappling with. So the term innovation and entrepreneurship are very much related to the work of Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, the Australian-American economist. And he also, talks a lot about things like business cycles and so on. One of the critical elements of his work, which I think is pertinent to our discussion, is the term creative destruction. He argues that there are periods of when you have swarming of innovation, as we are currently experiencing today, and that these swarming of innovations generate a process of creative destruction, which is that it creates a new framework whereby the old economic structures are forced to, or sidelined, or disrupted, as we use in terminology today, and new economic structures and new business models are put in place by the new technologies, but also what Carlota Perez calls a new economic business and technology paradigm. So a techno-economic paradigm is replaced by a new one, and that drives the processes of innovation and entrepreneurship. And so in many respects, my presentation is premised on this notion and understanding that innovation trends are not just one continuous stream. There are peaks and troughs, and we are going through a process of where it's peaking, and consequently, it has a dramatic impact or shift on the economy and society across the board in many regions. It also results in geopolitical shifts, so that the countries that underinvest in the new techno-economic paradigm tend to get sidelined or get demoted in the global economy. And so we see an increasing shift. So, for example, with the rise of China, et cetera, et cetera. I was just looking at the recent OECD Science, Technology, and Innovation Outlook, and they made this statement right at the outset that the pandemic has been a reminder that science, technology, and innovation policy is essential to build resiliency and enable adaptation to shocks. It is also a critical enabler of sustainability transitions, notably the green transition. And this is just a signal that the current context or the contemporary context for innovation encompasses a whole range of issues. So whether you're talking about the green transition and move to net zero, to deal with the climate change crisis or the climate change emergency that we are faced with, or the fact that we have a context where emerging diseases such as COVID-19 are going to be more rampant in the emerging unfolding context. So So science, technology, and innovation is not just about the economy in the classic or narrow sense of things. It's about grappling with many of these traditional issues or wider issues. I'm also reminded that the work of Arthur Lewis, in fact, it is his last book. It's entitled Growth and Fluctuations. And in it, like Schumpeter, he uses long wave theory to explain shifts in the global economy. And he makes the point at the end of the book that the long run engine of growth is technological change and not trade, except in the initial period of laying development foundations. And what you see in many developing countries, and in fact, in terms of the prescriptions that are given to developing countries, is that they should largely focus on trade. And so focus on trade, focus on foreign direct investment, and so on, as the mechanisms for generating their development futures. When in fact, what Lewis has argued is that it is technological change that is the key driver and not relying on trade, because trade by itself, if it is not underpinned by technological and innovation shifts, will result in the terms of trade working against you, and ultimately a decline in your economic performance, increased poverty, increased indebtedness, etc. So many of the issues that we are faced with here in the Caribbean are a result of the fact that we have not paid heed to these recommendations. So there's a whole range of rationales for why we should be investing more in science, technology, and innovation policies. It has to do with moving from a low value added commodity production framework to higher value added activities, addressing the problems of deindustrialization. And if you look at the way in which China has impacted Latin America and the Caribbean, huge economies in the region are being deindustrialized, as well as faced with significant challenges of meeting their domestic needs. It's about moving from declining sectors to rising sectors. It's about correcting externalities in specific sectors, boosting competitiveness, as well as addressing the problems of both market failure and government failure, which tend to be very rampant in developing countries. So it's not just whether it's the government or the private sector that the issue is actually both key sectors tend to be underperforming when it comes to science, technology, and innovation. What I'll do now is quickly go through some of the trade performance. So I'm just going to show some of the data very quickly. And this is a very familiar story for anyone who's been looking at the Caribbean economy for the last few decades. I pulled up this slide and this graph is from 1996 to 2021. And what's really remarkable is the fact that the Trinidad and Tobago economy is the key driver of exports from CARICOM. But look at this volatility. It's a boom and bust cycle, largely dependent on fossil fuel prices. The thing is, you could see that for most Caribbean economies, they're flatlined for the last several decades. No growth. The only one that's poking its head up, it's Guyana. And that's, again, now because of fossil fuel exports. And so in a few years from now, the not too distant future, Guyana is more than likely going to surpass Trinidad and Tobago as the biggest exporter from the region, but it is in hydrocarbons. This is reflected when you look at this profile of both CARICOM and Trinidad and Tobago's merchandise exports. So yes, Trinidad and Tobago's exports and manufacturing have increased over time, but by and large, it's still raw material extraction that is the key driver of the Caribbean economy. Now, I wrote a paper, must be 10 years ago, and I was able to map the data for the Caribbean. And it was only for a very brief period, between 1995 and about 2005, did we see significant growth in manufacturing. Thereafter, there was a significant reversal, and our exports of merchandise became more prominent. So we reverted to the framework that obtained between 1960 and 1980, where the key driver of exports from the region were commodities. So some would argue, well, what about services? Well, if you look like a country like Trinidad and Tobago, merchandise trade is our key source of income generation. And we do generate a surplus in merchandise trade, largely because of fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, and all the other areas in agriculture. In agriculture and manufacturing, we are actually net importers. So in this slide to the left, you could see that merchandise trade for 2021, we've generated a bit of a surplus, but in trade and services, the balance is in the negative. And that's the case historically. So that even though we have a strong banking, insurance, finance sector, and then you count tourism, which is not huge in Trinidad and Tobago's case, but in other Caribbean countries, it's more important. Still generating a negative balance. And then I went to look at the intellectual property profile for Trinidad and Tobago. And why did I do this? Intellectual property income, or what we call receipts from the use of intellectual property, is one of the fastest rising areas of growth in the global economy. In fact, the economies that have significant growth in intellectual property receipts are the fastest growing economies, the economies with the strongest innovation potential, and so on. So in Trinidad and Tobago, this data hasn't changed over the last 20 years or more that I've been looking at it. In terms of patent applications, it was mostly non-residents. In fact, for 2021, there was only one patent application by a resident from Trinidad and Tobago. And then trademarks tends to have a more participation, but is, again, predominantly non-residents. And it's only in the industrial designs we saw more residents than non-residents, but the numbers are really small. So it's 12 residents as opposed to 4 non-residents in terms of industrial designs. This has been the case for the last 20 years, and not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the whole Caribbean. I mapped the Caribbean performance in intellectual property and patent registration in a paper about 10 years ago. And I compared the whole Caribbean with Singapore. So in the last decade or so, Singapore registers more patents on an annual basis than the whole Caribbean has done in the last 50 years. Let me say that again. Singapore registers more patents on an annual basis than all Caribbean countries, and I've counted every Caribbean country from Cuba all the way to French Guyana on an annual basis over the last 50 years compared to what we've done in the last 50 years. So it means then that what we have in the Caribbean are not innovation nations. They don't invest in innovation, and consequently, their trade is largely reliant on traditional commodity exports. And even in services is largely commodity services with low value added, particularly in the area of tourism. Next slide. It's not moving. Okay, one of the key trends globally is the expanding investment by countries in research and development. In fact, there's an innovation race going on right now. And that's what you find happening in a period of creative destruction. you find that there's an acceleration of this process. So at one end, we have Korea, South Korea, which has the highest level of investment, over 4.5% of its GDP being expended on research and development. And I had the good fortune of visiting Korea at least 3 times now. And my first visit was to go look at their science, technology, and innovation infrastructure. And it's absolutely amazing what they've been doing for the last several decades. And that's why they're such a significant outlier. China is catching up with the United States. And in fact, in some key sectors, we find that China has actually surged ahead of the United States and many of the other European countries. But what's notable in this diagram is that the Latin American and Caribbean countries, represented by Mexico and Chile, are to the far left of the diagram. It means then that they're investing the least in terms of GDP, and then the number of researchers per 1,000 is also very low. And you know, in this business, you say you must be careful which neighborhood you're living in. Well, we don't have a choice which neighborhood that we are in, but clearly we're in the neighborhood with the lowest level of investment in research and development. And that's quite significant. So when you look at, in this slide, I compare Trinidad and Tobago with Costa Rica and with the Latin American and Caribbean average for investment in research and development as a share of GDP and in relation to per capita income. And Trinidad and Tobago in the first slide is below Costa Rica by a significant margin, and is spending 1/10 of the Latin American and Caribbean average. So Latin America and the Caribbean is the region with one of the regions with the lowest investment in science, technology, and innovation, and Trinidad and Tobago is 1/10 of that. And we've been doing this for a long time. So the data that I've been looking at for Trinidad and Tobago since 2000 and earlier late 1990s has remained steady state. So this is irrespective of governments, political parties, who's the prime minister. It has nothing to do with that. It's systemic, it's cultural. And it's the same across the wider Caribbean. There's not a Caribbean country that is investing in any significant way in research and development, in innovation, or anything to compare, even with its neighbors, for far more for the wider world. And then when you look at the expenditure, it's in case of Trinidad and Tobago, it's largely government driven, very low participation of business enterprises, and higher education is fairly low as well relative to what you find in other parts of the world and even other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's also that when you compare the type of activity, the bulk of it is either in basic or applied research. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we do have some experimental development areas. But when you compare us with Latin America more widely, and if you compare us with what's happening in the OECD economies, for example, it tends to be fairly low. And I went to the Global Innovation Index to, dissect some of this a little bit further. So the way this data works is that the higher you are on the graph is the worse your performance, because it's comparing your rank. So Trinidad and Tobago's rank among the 130 plus countries is pretty high. I think overall we are 94. Which compared to our high income status puts us, when we are ranked or compared with other high income economies, we are among the lowest performing from an innovation standpoint. But here I'm comparing us with middle income countries like Costa Rica and Mauritius, and it's only in the area of knowledge workers that Trinidad and Tobago outperforms these other two economies. So I want to talk about the Trade Innovation Governance Framework. And why am I doing this? Well, it is clear from the data and the evidence that Trinidad and Tobago and most other Caribbean economies are not in the innovation game. And we are doing this at our peril, which is that investing in innovation is like a pension scheme. It assures your future income. I know a lot of my economist friends talk about growth. Well, where does growth come from? Growth comes from innovation. If you remain in the same sector, at some point in time, you are going to, and if you're not innovating, you are going to lose your share of global value added. And if you look at the manufacturing value added for the Caribbean over the last 3 decades, it's declined considerably. We have shrinking economies relative to the global context. So what do we need to do? I decided to identify 3 key areas for transformation. I had a longer list in my head, but I decided in the interest of time, to talk about 3 key things. The first is promoting innovation startup cultures. At the OECD, where I worked for a short time, we were working with countries to develop production transformation policy reviews. And part of that process involved looking at the startup culture and the startup mechanisms in various economies. And so one of the publications that's pertinent for this discussion is one that looked at Latin America and identified some key areas for action. So for example, it identified a funding gap, which is what I've highlighted. The R&D expenditures in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean are extremely low relative to our neighborhood. And then there's the information asymmetries. And often there's also a disjuncture between different elements of let's say, the governmental administration. So is the Ministry of Trade talking with the ministry that deals with industrial policy or innovation? And what about the higher educational institutions? Are they being involved in the new discussions about where to take the economy? Often in developing countries, the answer to those questions are no. And so there tends to be a lot of information asymmetry as well as asymmetries in terms of action. There tends to be also an absence of demand from the private sector. So the private sector is not demanding of the higher educational institutions or some of the governmental institutions an innovation set of services. So that relates to absorptive capacity. There's a little tradition of business and innovation. And so you're talking about transforming mindsets. And last but not least, you're also talking about reforming many of the legal frameworks. So for example, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has just put out the new procurement legislation. Well, have we included strategic government procurement as a framework for investing in innovation? Is there provisions for green procurement so that we could ramp out, for example, a shift towards renewable energy, where all government buildings, for example, would have photovoltaics, rainwater capture, LED buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge opportunity there for transformation, which would stoke the innovation environment. The second area, and it deals with a lot of the research I've been doing over the last, again, 20 years. I've been mapping the diasporic economy, and the key driver of growth in the Caribbean has been through the diasporic economy. So if you look at the economy like Jamaica, for example, remittances accounts for 15–16% of GDP. Then if you start adding all of the other areas of the diasporic economy, like diasporic exports, people sending home money, not for remittances only, but for things like mortgages, that's another 1 or 2%. And then there's diasporic tourism, et cetera, et cetera. So our estimates are that for a country like Jamaica, the diasporic economy accounts for somewhere between 20 and 25% of GDP. And it's bigger than foreign direct investment and is significantly more important than aid flows. And so we've been mapping out a strategy that involves tapping into the diasporic economy, not only for exports, but also for attracting talent. Now, this is a strategy that's been adopted by many countries, including very large economies like China and India, but also smaller economies. You see it in Thailand. Mexico is doing the same. Several countries are tapping into the diasporas for accessing talent, innovation, but also even finances. So diaspora bonds, also tapping into utilizing remittances as a means to collateralize imports. So there's a whole array of mechanisms that we can utilize tapping into the diaspora. And so this is a study that I did for Compete Caribbean a few years ago, looking at diasporic entrepreneurship. The last area I wanted to talk about, which is really, bringing it all home, is to say that in Trinidad and Tobago, like in many parts of the Caribbean, we are not short on institutions. In fact, I would argue that we are institution rich, but in effect, strategy poor. And this is because we have a lot of institutions operated in silos, operating largely with very low levels of collaboration and coherence. And it doesn't bode well for our national innovation ecosystem. The key thing to make an innovation ecosystem work is coordination and collaboration. We're not talking about more money necessarily. We're talking about utilizing the resources more effectively and with a clear strategy in mind. Because in a small economy, you can't do everything under the sun. You have to figure out what are the 8 to 10 sectors that you can go after to make a difference. And then you pull all of your critical capabilities together to move in that direction. So we've identified here, who's facilitated in terms of market access, which governmental agencies are engaged in facilitation, who are the financial actors, who are the cultural impactors, which support organizations are out there. And then last but not least, what is the role of the higher educational institutions in terms of training people for the innovation objectives? Because I like to conclude by making the point that education policy is innovation policy, which is that without educators, without educational institutions, the innovation agenda is not realizable. I know I'm, working in a higher educational institution, and maybe I'm, speaking from this very narrow perspective, but the literature bears it out well that the economies and societies that have a higher percentage of their population that have gained higher educational tertiary level training tend to do better in innovation and economic competitiveness. But I think what we have to do more in a more considerate way or focused way is figure out what are the areas in higher educational training that we need to place more emphasis on and be more strategic about that. I would dare say that we are currently not doing that very well. We need to, I think, regroup and rethink what are the areas that we need to be investing in to advance the interests of our population and our society and our region. I'll end on that note and invite any questions or comments from the audience. So back to you, Rian.
Thank you, Dr. Nurse. I think you covered quite a range of topics in your presentation. So we thank you very much for that valuable insight. Just to note to the participants, after this Q&A session, we will take a group photo, a screenshot, if you please, where we ask the participants to turn on their cameras. We'll also be sharing our feedback form for your insights and feedback on this session specifically. I do see that we have a few questions in the chat already. If you also want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you and we'll unmute your mic so that you can ask that question. So to get to the first question I'm seeing in the chat from April Bryan, we have Dr. Nurse, we're asking, what do you attribute to the low number of patent applications from Trinidad? Trinidad has a few research institutions and universities. Shouldn't they be contributing to the innovation ecosystem in the country and region?
Okay, that's a big question.
And you probably have some good insight as you head of COSTAATT as well.
Yeah. Okay, if you look at the data that I didn't show it in this presentation, but the country with the highest number of patent registrations in the Caribbean is the Bahamas.
Interesting.
And I was like, wow. So I called my friends in the Bahamas and I said, what's going on in the Bahamas? And they said, no, don't worry about it. It's not Bahamians doing this. It's Americans who've become residents who are doing this. Okay, so to answer the question is that we are not encouraging and facilitating innovation from the early stages in our education system right through. Right? So innovators and patent, creators don't fall out of trees. They have to be nurtured and co-created in an institutional environment. So in fact, one of my colleagues has asked me, but Dr. Nurse, I bet you some of our Caribbean people in the diaspora are registering patents. And I went, yes, of course they are, because they are living and working in environments that foster patent applications and innovation.
And entrepreneurship.
And entrepreneurship as well. All right, so it's the ecosystem.
Yeah, I don't think the talent is lacking. It's bringing that out of our people that we're not necessarily getting the key to unlock that skill. So I hope that we answered that question, April. I see a second question here from Martin Lee John, and I think it might be sort of rhetorical questions, but I'll ask it anyway. Martin asked, is there a company in Trinidad and Tobago which has an R&D department? Is there any company which has an R&D yearly budget? Is there any company which administrates over its intellectual property? Is there a company which has a resident IP agent or IP attorney? So those are some of the questions from Martin. I don't know if you have any answers there, Dr. Nurse, or have any views on those questions.
Well, you can bet your bottom dollar that Angostura does. They have an important trade secret that they are able to commercialize. So yeah, for sure, Angostura. I'm sure there are a few other companies in Trinidad and Tobago that for which the answer to that will be yes. The issue is scale. It's not that we don't have any. Is that in relative terms, we are operating at a very low scale. And it's not that we're not attempting or trying to build out an ecosystem. Of course, NEHUS has been doing stuff. COSTAATT, we've been doing stuff. UWI has just launched their new, chocolate factory, which is a great news. Trinidad and Tobago's Trinitario cocoa is the benchmark, global benchmark. So we're late to the game, but nonetheless, we need to advance in this area. And there are a few other areas. There was a company, I don't know if they're still in operation, that had a patent on their motorboats, and they were producing them in Laventille, and containerizing them and shipping them to the United States. So it is not that there aren't any
examples, yeah.
innovation firms, right? It is in relative terms, it's still small scale to the size of the economy and to the dimensions of the challenge that we are faced with. If you look at all the things that are coming on the pipeline, from climate change to chronic non-communicable diseases, large food import bill, and so on. Most of the things that I mentioned at the beginning.
Agreed. And I do have some other questions here in the chat. I see Richard Hilson has asked, do you have any data on the fields where the many patents in Singapore came from to share, I'm guessing? Dr. Nurse, any data on those fields? I mean, probably could Google some. Probably if you Google, you might have more information that comes up there. Sorry.
Ask ChatGPT. You will get the answer in seconds. Okay, but let me give you an example. And this is illustrative. So yeah, again, it must have been 20 years ago. I went to a workshop in Austria, and the guy sitting on next to me was from Singapore's Biotechnology Institute. And he said something that was really remarkable and blew my mind. And I've used it many times in presentations. He said to the workshop, he said, in Singapore, we didn't know anything about biotechnology, except that it was going to be big in the future. Okay, so if you go and you do a chat GPT on Singapore's patents, I bet you that a significant share of it is in biotechnology. And you know what they were doing? Every year, they were sending away 10 people, up to, I think, 20 or 30 people per year to go and do PhDs in biotech. Trinidad and Tobago is sending far more many people than that to go do a whole array of scholarships in areas. But what they did was to pick a sector that was going to grow in the future, which you didn't know anything about, except that it was going to grow, and put some resources behind it. And then they invited foreign firms to come and set up operations, and they built a strategy around FDI and local development of firms as well as researchers and research institutions. And today, they are a big player. Singapore right. outspends and outperforms many European countries that are 10, 15, 20 times bigger than it is. So
the lessons are there from all of these countries developing, established.
Has nothing to do with size. Has to do with strategy.
With strategy.
Strategy.
Yeah. So I hope that response was satisfactory, Richard. I see Martin has a follow-up question about where can one get help in the development of one's ideas? Where are the funding sources for R&D? Where are our prototype builders? Where is the local template in R&D access for funding? Do institutions such as banks and credit unions facilitate R&D as a special area? And Dr. Nish, you probably will have additional information here, but I could probably start with where some of these sources are to help answer the question. Martin, in terms of development of one's ideas and prototyping, you can actually, we offer those services at NIHIRS through our Fab Lab, and we are in the process of developing, which is to launch soon an ecosystem map to make available to the public all the different areas and resources available to the everyday Joe to access, to develop their ideas and assist with the development of ideas and kind of take you through that roadmap of how you can accomplish this. So that's one thing. So hopefully you can reach out to Nehus and we can help you with the development of an idea, or anyone in here who has an idea and is looking for some help with prototype development, we can help with that. Also with the map, it should be able to show you some of the funding agencies that are available to citizens for development of ideas, etc. Now, it's a long process. It's not going to be easy, but there are resources available. So I just wanted to, make that point before I hand over to you, Dr. Nurse.
Yeah, and if I could do a little bit of a shameless plug, at COSTAATT, one of the things that we've actually reframed our academic structure. So we are introducing a new school, and we've revamped all of the other schools that we have. So we have a school of environment, circular economy, and sustainability that's going to be rolling out from September. But we are also introducing upskilling academies. So we've identified 5 or 6 sectors, and we will be building out training linked to an incubator, linked to an accelerator. Now, once again, these things are not necessarily new. The issue in Trinidad and Tobago and in the rest of the Caribbean is that we are not doing these things at the required scale or with the required consistency. So what tends to happen is that a project or initiative might be funded by an external entity. And when that funding runs out, that's the end of the process. And we go to square one. Or that there may be a change in government or change in minister, and everything goes back to square one. Right? So in small societies, we can ill afford this process of inconsistency and underinvestment in innovation. We are doing this at our peril. And if you look at all the data that I referred to at the beginning, all the challenges that we're faced with, it's problems related to things like social innovation, dealing with crime, dealing with the chronic non-communicable disease crisis that we are faced with, dealing with flooding, right? I mean, I can just go down the list. None of these are beyond our capacity to address or fix. It is that we don't have a clear strategy, a set of coherent frameworks, and the capacity, I would argue, to stick with it over the long haul, right? So we have to frame a 10, 15, 20-year strategy and not a framework based on the budget cycle of a year. That seems to be the planning framework in Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean now. In the good old days, we used to talk about medium-term economic planning. Well, we haven't been doing that for at least 20, 25 years now. And the results are showing.
I see here, Nadine left a comment about the problem is funding, which speaks to the capacity after, we get funds for a certain project from grants and funding companies that, once it's done, we're back to square one. So Nadine, we are making note and see your comments. And that also leads into the capacity building, as mentioned by Dr. Nurse. I have a question from April with regards to Carnival, and that there's a lot of creativity and innovation in Carnival each year. If you see, Dr. Nurse, that there are opportunities for cultural innovation with regards to Carnival bands and the steel pan.
Oh gosh, well, April must have been looking at to see what I do research on and write.
She saw a paper.
I've been writing.
A paper. She saw your paper. She saw the draft. Oh Lord.
Oh dear. I've been writing and talking about this now. I'm really dating myself in this presentation. I keep referring to 20 years ago, 25 years ago. My most famous
the 90s is 20 years ago. Oh, crazy.
20 some, almost 30 years ago.
Oh gosh, don't remind me.
Yeah, it's really sad. My most famous paper is about the globalization of Trinidad Carnival. We in Trinidad and Tobago have no idea of the size and scale of our carnival and its offspring all over the world. And we have no clear strategy. I can say that without fear of contradiction. We think that Carnival is an annual event that happens in the Savannah in Port of Spain. And our approach is, and our budgeting and our funding is premised on that notion. We see it as an event, not as an industry. Okay? And so the mindset, and this is why transforming mindset is a critical element of the process, we could do another discussion on Carnival and the cultural and creative sector, right? So if you want, you could call me and ask me to do that. I could do that off the top
I'll
of my
call
head,
you. I'll
right?
call you.
But I just wanted to make one more point, though, about the issue of, well, the problem is money. Often what we find is for facilitating the growth of innovation-driven enterprises, the biggest challenge is not money, is that many of these firms actually don't know what to do with the money if they were given the money, right? So business coaching, shepherding is more important and has greater value than the money. So any program needs to have this built into it. So if you're just giving people money to go and start off their new businesses and so on, and not putting in place a mechanism for business coaching, the failure rate of those firms is going to be high. So you want to, in effect, de-risk that process by building in this framework to generate the business coaching dimension.
Thanks for that, Dr. Nurse. I see a couple comments here, not really questions, but I see St. Clair King has stated that there's a view that the TNT private sector, because of its history, cannot adapt to using innovations. A view submitted by Prof. Foster, and the participants are really plantation suppliers that depend on the rents from petroleum. Hence, we need to build a new private sector, and that cannot be left to the serendipity of the population. I don't know if you have any comments with regards to that statement made by one of our participants, Dr. Nurse.
Oh no, Professor King is you know, he's spoken eloquently on these matters for a long time. I don't have much to add except to endorse it in the sense that one of my mentors is Carlota Perez. All right. Okay. And she argues that development is a moving target, which is that if you are not investing in the future, it means you're falling behind. All right. And she talks about all these techno-economic paradigms and so on. In fact, she used to live in Trinidad for a short while. So she's Venezuelan economist at Cambridge. The key point is this, she argues additionally, is that you need to tilt the market. She says those in the private sector don't necessarily, unless they're in a very dynamic economic context, move towards innovation because they make enough money on the foreign exchange spread, for example, in the banks, or the interest rate spread. Like, why would you innovate if you could make money easily? All right. So in effect, the role of the government is to steer the market, to tilt the market, to create an incentive set of mechanisms which would encourage the larger firms and those with resources to move in that direction. And so that's something that we can do more skillfully here in Trinidad and Tobago. We haven't been employing that mechanism well enough. So that's where policy comes into place, and governance and leadership.
Yeah. And also, because I see a question here from Martin again about the local successes, and I think a big part of it also is showcasing. I know that Kariri has showcased persons that have gone through their innovation incubation hubs and that sort of thing, but really getting it out there to show the average citizen that it's not just big companies that can do innovation, it's you in your daily life as well. And those can lead to big ideas. Like it's also showing that the average person has access to resources to be able to become their own success stories. And I see here, Nadine has mentioned some other challenges, lack of access to data on a whole, not enough is being collected, and even when it does exist, it's not shared. I'm guessing is what her complete sentence was there. And then hiring practices for innovation also mentioned is corruption. We right at the 1 minute past 11 o'clock
Okay.
time though.
Well,
And I would love to continue the conversation. So I just wanted to give everybody that heads up that we passed 11, but we could probably go until 5 past, 10 past, if Dr. Nurse is willing to continue the
yeah,
conversation.
I'm at your disposal. But let me make a
Okay.
comment. I want us to, well, now that we've identified and recognized many of the challenges, what we need to do is now figure out where are the opportunities, all right? So if you can't identify any opportunities, then you need to get out of the game completely, all right? So there's some huge opportunities that are right before our eyes. So let's take the problem of the chronic non-communicable disease profile in the Caribbean. Well, if you look at how we spend resources on healthcare and wellness, it's largely focused on curative medicine. You go to the doctor, you get pills, whatever. Sorry, I'm being, facetious or provocative here. Right? But so we have a health system that is premised purely, almost purely on curative medicine. If you were to transform this system and convert 5% every year or 10% every year in the expenditure towards preventative health, you now create a whole new cadre of job opportunities. And you have better outcomes in terms of the wellness of your society. So, and this doesn't require us to earn any foreign exchange or to, to export to any other sector or other economy. We're talking about just this expenditure in Trinidad and Tobago. If we build out enough firms that are going to have the capacity ultimately to service the domestic economy, they could then service the wider Caribbean economy, because most Caribbean countries are spending somewhere between 3 and 5 or 6% of their GDP on health, and most of that money is to address chronic non-communicable diseases. That's a sector right there. That's a business opportunity. If you look at our food import bill as well, right, there are huge areas for opportunities of what we call import replacement strategy. And, our food is linked to our health. So if we could increase the participation of local firms producing higher quality carbohydrates, for example, in convenience food so that people can easily access it, then you're talking about creating and dynamizing the agricultural sector, because historically it's been focused on, again, plantation agriculture, commodity extraction for export. So you can create in just those two areas, in the area of health and food, tremendous new growth opportunities for jobs, in wider employment, entrepreneurship, and so on. If you then add the area of energy, and Trinidad and Tobago is hooked on its fossil fuels, but the demand for renewables and the demand for alternative energy usage is going through the roof. And yes, Trinidad and Tobago is doing well to build out some solar farms and so on. But again, it's still small scale, because if you look at the share of our energy usage in non-renewables, it's over 90%. In fact, it's probably like 95%. So there's a huge opportunity to ramp out renewables and to incentivize a shift in that direction. So those three sectors, when combined, account for close to 30 to 40% of our imports, right? Not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the Caribbean. And Trinidad can play a leadership role in dynamizing these three sectors and building out export capacity to service the wider region. So that's where the opportunities reside. And there are lots of other areas on the export side too. Of course, cultural creative industries, or Carnival is one of my pet areas of research. And then our manufacturing sector, I think, has done well over the last 2 decades. We need to put more resources behind them to build out the light manufacturing, as well as some of these niche and specialized areas of manufacturing. And anyway, I think you get the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
So there's some opportunities in terms of import replacement, and then there's some opportunities in terms of export orientation. So that's where I think we need to be focusing our attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Nurse. So we are at 7 minutes past 11. I don't have any other questions, just a few comments in the chat. Dr. King would have said that you're correct about trying to get the private sector to move to innovation via incentives, but the triple helix system could be a model, that we can adapt for our circumstances. And I see here, Martin would like to hear some presenters with personal experiences. I think that we may have a future session with some entrepreneurs on board, Martin. So hopefully you can join us for that. But we truly appreciate the time and effort that Dr. Nurse has given to prepare the presentation and have this conversation. I'm sure everyone in attendance can agree that this has been such a rewarding experience this morning, having this conversation, having this talk, being frank about some of the challenges that we have in the Caribbean and in Trinidad and Tobago specifically, but, learning from experiences of other regions to kind of try and develop a strategy for how we can best increase innovation in Trinidad and Tobago and the region. I don't know if you have any last words, Dr. Nurse, but if you will, after your last words, if you would stop sharing so that we can take the screenshot image of all the attendees where everyone puts on their camera and says innovation, that would be great. But I'll hand over for you for any last words, Dr. Nurse.
Yeah, well, it would be remiss of me not to say that, that the education sector can and should play a larger role in terms of this innovation dynamism that I'm referring to. As I said in my presentation, education policy is innovation policy. So I think the COSTAATT, where I work, is ramping up to offer wider services in this area. And so I look forward to having discussions with potential partners to make this happen. But I really want to thank NIHUS for pulling this together, for having this webinar series. We need to be having more of these discussions. We need to be elevating the discourse, and we need to generate more publications and research on the issue of innovation and entrepreneurship. And really, I really would like to say that this is an important initiative that needs to be done perpetually, right? We should be having these discussions every week, every month, going forward. So thanks again to NIHUS for, kicking the ball in this direction.
And thank you, Dr. Nurse, for joining us arm in arm in the effort. I would like to ask everyone to put on your camera now so I may take a screenshot, but also just to share that we have shared our evaluation form for this morning's session. If you can, click the link and fill it out, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. It only helps us to increase awareness and increase our offerings to the public. So thanks everyone for filling out that feedback after the session this morning. Again, the link is in the chat. I see a lot of people putting on the cameras. Thank you so much, guys, for cooperating. This will be our last activity for the session this morning before we close off and say goodbye. So just quickly, everyone, put on your camera. I'll give you warning when I'm about to take the screenshot. So you can give us a nice big smile. Okay. All right, I think I have most everyone with their cameras on. Yeah, you can make your adjustments. Great. Thank you, everyone. Give us a nice big smile. Big smile, big smile. Innovation. Great. And screenshot taken. I'll take a couple more. Great, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We really I enjoyed having the conversation, Dr. Nurse. I enjoyed all the engagement from the attendees. Continue to keep in contact with us. Please fill out the evaluation form and look out for more events of this nature from NEHRS in the near future. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care.